The autumn wind carried dust across the parking lot of Miller County Livestock Auction, swirling around the boots of ranchers and horse traders who'd gathered under the overcast Montana sky. It was the kind of November morning that promised early snow, with clouds heavy and grey hanging low over the distant Crazy Mountains. Inside the auction barn, the air was thick with the smell of hay, manure and coffee from the concession stand where men in worn Carhartt jackets exchanged gossip about cattle prices and winter feed costs. Rowan Beckett stood near the back rail of the auction ring. His 19-year-old frame lean from years of ranch work, his calloused hands resting on the worn wood as he watched the parade of horses being led through. His father, Calder Beckett, stood beside him, catalogue rolled in one hand, his weathered face skeptical as always. The Beckett Ranch, 300 acres nestled in the foothills outside Willow Creek, ran cattle primarily. But Calder had agreed they needed another working horse, with old Duke getting too arthritic for serious mountain work. "That bay gelding might be worth a look," Calder muttered, nodding toward a solid quarter horse that had just entered the ring. "Good bone structure. Probably handle the rough country." Rowan nodded absently, but his attention had drifted to the holding pens visible through the side gate. There, among the horses waiting their turn, stood an animal that made him pause. It was a paint horse, or what should have been one. Its coat was a chaotic pattern of brown, white, and what looked like mud-caked patches, impossible to determine if it was natural coloring or just filth. The horse was painfully thin, ribs visible even from a distance, its mane tangled into knots. But it wasn't the horse's bedraggled appearance that caught Rowan's eye. It was the way it was standing. While the other horses in the pen shifted nervously, heads down or turned away from the noise of the auction, this one stood perfectly still, head raised, ears forward, watching everything with an intensity Rowan had rarely seen in an animal. Its eyes, even from 30 feet away, had a clarity, a focus that didn't match its wrecked exterior. "Dad," Rowan said quietly, "look at that paint in pen 7. Calder glanced over, then shook his head immediately. "That bag of bones? Son, that horse looks like it's been through hell and back, probably half-starved and sour-minded. We need a worker, not a charity case." The auctioneer's voice crackled through the speakers, rapid-fire words blending together as lot numbers rolled past. The bay gelding Calder had liked went for $1,200 to a rancher from Big Timber. Then came a succession of saddle horses, a few draft crosses, and a string of younger horses that drew competitive bidding. Finally, Lot 43 was called. The paint horse was led into the ring by a handler who kept his distance, the lead rope held at full extension. The moment the horse entered, a wave of dismissive murmurs rippled through the crowd. Under the barn's fluorescent lights, the animal looked even worse. Patches of hair missing on its hindquarters, one ear that drooped oddly, and a pronounced limp in its right front leg as it was walked in a circle. "Lot 43, 6-year-old paint gelding," the auctioneer announced without enthusiasm. "Needs some TLC, folks. Let's start the bidding at $50. Silence. "Come on now, $50. Do I hear 50? More silence. Someone laughed. Rowan heard a man behind him mutter to his companion, "That thing's only good for dog food. Save yourself the trouble of putting it down." But Rowan was watching the horse's eyes. As the handler pulled the lead, trying to make the horse trot to show its gait, something happened that made Rowan's breath catch. The horse turned its head, not toward the handler or the auctioneer, but directly toward Rowan. For 3 seconds, their eyes locked. And in that moment, Rowan saw something he couldn't explain. Not fear, not resignation, but a kind of desperate intelligence, as if the horse was trying to communicate something urgent. Then the horse did something extraordinary. It stopped limping. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The pronounced hobble in its right leg simply vanished, and the horse stood square, weight distributed evenly. Then, as if to make a point, it lifted that same right leg and held it suspended for a moment before placing it down firmly. The gesture was so deliberate, so clearly intentional, that Rowan felt a chill run down his spine. "Did you see that?" Rowan whispered urgently. "See what?" Calder asked, already turning his attention to the catalogue for the next lot. "The limp. It just stopped. Dad, that horse was faking it." Calder looked up, frowning. "Horses don't fake injuries, Rowan. It probably just $25. The auctioneer's voice cut through, dropping the starting bid. "Can I get 25? Going once at no bid." Rowan's hand shot up before his brain caught up with his instincts. "We have 25 from the young man in the back. Do I hear 50? The barn was silent, except for the shuffle of boots and the occasional cough. No one else was bidding. Why would they? The horse looked like a liability, not an asset. Going once. Going twice. Sold for $25 to bidder 217. Calder turned to Rowan with an expression somewhere between disbelief and resignation. "Son, what in God's name did you just do?" Rowan wasn't entirely sure himself. All he knew was that something about that horse wasn't right, or rather, was far more right than it appeared. "Dad, trust me on this. There's something about that horse." "Yeah, there's something about it," Calder replied, shaking his head. "It's half dead, and we just paid $25 for the privilege of putting it down humanely on our own property." But as they walked to the auction office to settle payment and arrange transport, Rowan glanced back at the holding pen. The paint horse was watching him again, and if Rowan didn't know better, he'd swear the animal looked relieved. Chapter 2. The Mystery Deepens. The Beckett Ranch sat in a valley where Cottonwood Creek cut through the property, with the main house, barn, and corrals positioned to catch the morning sun, while being sheltered from the worst of the winter winds by a rise of lodgepole pines. It was the kind of place that had been in the family for 3 generations, built on hard work and the kind of stubborn determination that Montana required from anyone who wanted to make a living off the land. Rowan stood in the barn aisle early the next morning, watching as the paint horse emerged from the trailer. In the harsh light of dawn, with frost still clinging to the grass outside, the animal looked even more pitiful than it had at the auction. But those eyes, clear, amber-brown and intensely aware, tracked everything. "Let's get him into the quarantine pen," Calder said, standing well back. Years of experience had taught him caution with unknown horses. "Keep him separate from our string until we can get the vet out here. Dr. Morrison's coming this afternoon." Rowan led the horse carefully into a smaller pen they'd prepared, with fresh hay and a water trough. The moment he removed the lead rope, the horse moved to the water and drank deeply, then turned to the hay. But instead of tearing into it hungrily as a starved horse would, it ate methodically, almost daintily, selecting the best stems. "That's odd," Marlo Jensen said from behind them. Rowan turned to see their nearest neighbor approaching, her grey braid hanging over one shoulder of her insulated vest. Marlo was in her 60s, had been raising horses since before Rowan was born, and had forgotten more about equine behavior than most people ever learned. "What's odd, Mrs. Jensen?" Rowan asked. She tilted her head, studying the paint. "A horse in that condition should be frantic about food. Aggressive, even. But look at him. He's eating like he's at a Sunday buffet, taking his time. And see how he's positioned himself." Rowan looked. The horse had moved to the corner of the pen that gave him the best view of both the barn entrance and the pasture gate. Strategic positioning. "That's a trained behavior," Marlo continued, stepping closer to the rail. "He's been taught to stay aware of his surroundings while he eats. That's not something a range horse or even most ranch horses know. That's specialized training." Calder crossed his arms, his skepticism evident. "Or maybe he's just nervous." "Maybe," Marlo said, but she didn't sound convinced. Dr. Iris Morrison arrived that afternoon in her mobile vet truck, a compact woman in her 40s with capable hands and a no-nonsense manner. She spent 45 minutes examining the paint while Rowan held the lead rope, noting each finding in her tablet. "Well," she said finally, stripping off her latex gloves, "he's dehydrated, underweight by about 200 pounds, has some scarring on his hindquarters consistent with rope burns or restraints, and that ear droop is from an old injury, probably a hematoma that wasn't treated properly. But here's what's interesting." She pulled up an image on her tablet. "I scanned his microchip. He's registered under the name Sentinel's Promise. Bred in Kentucky 7 years ago. Good bloodlines, quarter horse and paint mix, bred for intelligence and trainability, but the registration was transferred 4 years ago to a company called Apex Animal Talent, based in California. They train animals for film and television work." Rowan felt his pulse quicken. "Film work? You mean like movie horses?" "Exactly like movie horses," Dr. Morrison confirmed, "which explains a lot about his behavior. These animals are trained to respond to incredibly specific cues, to act injured or scared or aggressive on command. That limp you mentioned seeing at the auction, I'd bet money that was a trained behavior. But how did he end up at a livestock auction in Montana looking like this?" Calder asked, his tone shifting from skeptical to concerned. "That," Dr. Morrison said grimly, "is the question. I've sent an inquiry to Apex Animal Talent. These companies usually track their animals carefully. They're valuable assets. Something went very wrong here." After the vet left, Rowan spent the evening in the barn, sitting on a hay bale outside the pen just watching. The horse, he couldn't bring himself to call it Sentinel's Promise. The name felt too formal. Had finished eating and now stood in that same alert posture, watching him back. "What happened to you?" Rowan asked quietly. "How'd you end up in that auction ring?" The horse's ear swiveled toward him at the sound of his voice. On impulse, Rowan stood and picked up a long training stick that was leaning against the wall. He'd seen enough horse training videos to know some basic cues. He pointed the stick to the left and said, "Over." The horse's eyes locked on the stick. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, smoothly and precisely, the horse sidestepped to the left, stopped, and looked at Rowan expectantly. Rowan's hands started shaking. He pointed right. Over. The horse sidestepped right, stopped, waited. "Holy hell," Rowan breathed. He tried another cue, raising the stick above his head. Up. The horse reared slightly on its hind legs, front hooves lifting barely a foot off the ground in a controlled, balanced movement, then settled back down. Rowan dropped the stick, his mind racing. This wasn't just a trained horse. This was a highly trained horse, probably worth thousands of dollars, that had somehow ended up abandoned and nearly starved. Someone had either lost him or, worse, deliberately gotten rid of him. The question was why. And as Rowan stared into those intelligent amber eyes, another question emerged. What exactly had this horse seen or been through that had led him to this moment? The scars on his hindquarters, the old ear injury, the weight loss, these weren't signs of simple neglect. They told a story of something darker. The horse took a step toward the rail, bringing his head close to where Rowan stood. It was the first time the animal had voluntarily approached him. Slowly, Rowan reached out and placed his hand on the horse's neck. Under his palm, he could feel the rapid heartbeat, the tension in the muscles. "We're going to figure this out," Rowan said quietly. "Whatever happened to you, you're safe now." The horse exhaled, a long, shuddering breath, and for just a moment leaned into Rowan's touch. Chapter 3. Uncovering the Past. 3 days later, Rowan sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him as he scrolled through his 5th straight hour of internet research. The November sun was already setting behind the mountains, painting the kitchen in shades of orange and amber. His mother had left dinner in the oven before heading to her shift at the hospital in Livingston, and his father was still out checking fence lines in the upper pasture. The response from Apex Animal Talent had come that morning, and it had opened a door into a story that made Rowan's stomach turn. According to the company's records, Sentinel's Promise had been one of their premier animals, trained for high-complexity work in film and television. He'd appeared in 3 major Western films and 2 television series, always cast in roles that required precision behavior, a horse that could react to gunfire, navigate dangerous terrain on cue, or perform specific actions that drove the plot forward. He'd been worth, at his peak, over $40,000. Then, 2 years ago, he'd been sold to a private buyer in Nevada named Lennox Hartwell. That's where the trail ended in Apex's records. But Rowan had kept digging, and what he'd found painted a disturbing picture. Lennox Hartwell ran what he advertised as a Western experience ranch, a place where wealthy tourists could live like real cowboys for a week. But reviews from former employees buried in obscure forum posts and complaint boards told a different story. Hartwell ran his horses hard, used punishment-based training methods, and when animals became unreliable or difficult, they disappeared. One former wrangler claimed Hartwell had connections to kill buyers, people who purchased horses cheaply to sell for slaughter. Rowan's hands clenched into fists as he read. The scars on the horse's hindquarters suddenly made sense. The ear injury, the weight loss. The horse had likely spent 2 years in conditions that broke down everything his original trainers had built, until he'd finally been deemed worthless and sent to auction. But something didn't quite fit. If the horse had been through such trauma, why was he so responsive? Why hadn't he become aggressive or shut down completely? Rowan had spent hours with him over the past few days, and while the horse was cautious, he wasn't fearful. If anything, he seemed to be waiting for something. The kitchen door opened, and Calder walked in, stamping snow off his boots. "Still at it?" he asked, moving to pour himself coffee. "Dad, look at this." Rowan turned the laptop around, showing his father the information he'd compiled. Calder read in silence, his jaw tightening. When he finished, he set down his coffee mug with controlled precision. So someone took a trained, valuable animal and basically tortured it. And then tried to dump him at auction for whatever they could get, probably hoping he'd end up at slaughter so there'd be no trail, Rowan finished. "Dad, I think he ended up in that auction by design. Whoever had him wanted him gone. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Calder said quietly. Before Rowan could answer, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Marlo Jensen. "Come to the barn, now. You need to see this." They found Marlo in the barn aisle, tablet in hand, with Dr. Morrison standing beside her. Both women wore expressions of barely contained excitement. "I got curious, Doctor," Morrison said without preamble, "so I reached out to some colleagues who work in animal-assisted therapy and search and rescue, sent them a description of your horse's behaviors. Rowan, watch this." She handed him the tablet, which showed a video of a horse working with what appeared to be a child with disabilities. The horse moved with careful precision, responding to subtle cues, positioning itself to provide support. The title of the video read, "Sentinel's Promise, Therapeutic Riding Demonstration, 2019. He wasn't just a film horse, Marlo explained. Before he was sold to Apex, he was trained for therapeutic work. These horses undergo extensive evaluation and training. They have to be bomb-proof, calm under pressure, responsive to handlers, and incredibly attuned to human emotion and body language." Rowan looked up from the tablet. "That's why he's been so calm." "Even after everything, that training stuck." "More than that," Dr. Morrison added, "I talked to his original trainer from the therapeutic program. She was devastated when she found out what happened to him. Apparently, he was one of the best horses she'd ever worked with. She said he had an almost uncanny ability to sense when someone was in distress. She called him the Sentinel because he always seemed to be watching, protecting. "So what happened?" Calder asked. "Why would she sell him?" "Yes, she didn't. The program lost funding and had to sell several horses. Apex Animal Talent bought him because therapeutic horses transition well to film work. They're stable, trainable, safe around chaos. She said she verified the company thoroughly before agreeing to the sale. She thought he'd have a good life. Instead, he ended up with Hartwell," Rowan said bitterly. Marlowe stepped closer to the pen where the horse stood watching them. "But here's what I find remarkable. After everything he's been through, he hasn't broken. He's still watching, still waiting. Rowan, when you worked with him yesterday, did you notice how he responded?" Rowan nodded. "He was perfect. Every cue I gave, he followed." "Because he's hoping," Marlowe said softly. "He's hoping that you're different, that you're one of the good ones. That horse hasn't given up on humans, even though humans have given him every reason to." That night, Rowan couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about everything they'd learned, about the journey that horse had taken from helping kids with disabilities to being starved and scarred. Around midnight, he gave up on sleep, pulled on his jacket, and walked out to the barn. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and his breath created white clouds in the still air. Inside the barn, the horses stirred in their stalls. But the paint was standing in his pen, head raised, as if he'd been waiting. "Hey, Sentinel," Rowan said quietly, using the name for the first time. It felt right somehow. The horse's ears pricked forward. Rowan opened the pen gate and stepped inside, something he probably shouldn't do with a horse they'd only had for a few days. But something told him it was okay. Sentinel didn't move as Rowan approached, just watched with those amber eyes that held so much intelligence. It was almost unsettling. "I'm sorry," Rowan said, placing his hand on the horse's neck. "I'm sorry for what they did to you. But I promise you, it's different here. We're going to get you healthy again. We're going to get you back to who you were meant to be." Sentinel turned his head and very gently pressed his nose against Rowan's chest. It was a gesture of trust, of tentative hope. And in that moment, Rowan felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about rescuing a horse anymore. This was about justice. Winter settled over the Montana Valley with the inevitability of the seasons, bringing snow that transformed the Beckett Ranch into something from a postcard. But in the barn, a different kind of transformation was taking place. It had been 6 weeks since Rowan brought Sentinel home from the auction. Under Dr. Morrison's care and a carefully managed feeding program, the horse had gained back almost all his lost weight. His coat, now properly cleaned and groomed, revealed a striking pattern of chocolate brown and white that caught the light. The scarring on his hindquarters was permanent, but the hair was growing back in most places. Even the drooped ear, which would never fully recover, had become a distinguishing feature rather than a flaw. But the real change was in his eyes. The desperate quality Rowan had seen that first day had been replaced by something calmer, more confident. Sentinel was coming back to himself. "He looks like a completely different animal," Tamsin Crawford said, leaning on the fence rail of the round pen where Rowan was working with Sentinel. Tamsin was a horse trainer from Bozeman, in her 30s, with a reputation for rehabilitating difficult horses. Marlowe had recommended her, and she'd been coming out twice a week to work with Rowan and Sentinel. She was impressed with what she was seeing. "The physical recovery is one thing," Tamsin continued, "but his mental state, that's what's remarkable. Rowan, most horses that go through what he did either become dangerous or completely shut down. He's doing neither. He's re-engaging. Rowan was working with Sentinel on liberty training. No lead rope, no halter, just voice and body language. He'd started with basic movements, but in the past week they'd progressed to more complex sequences. Now he gave a subtle hand signal and stepped backward. Sentinel followed, matching Rowan's pace perfectly, stopping when Rowan stopped, moving when he moved. It was like a dance. "Try the obstacle course," Tamsin suggested. Over the past month they'd set up various obstacles in the pen: a tarp on the ground, a line of ground poles, a small bridge made of wooden pallets, a curtain of plastic strips hanging from a frame. For a horse with Sentinel's background, these weren't just training exercises, they were tests of trust. Rowan led Sentinel toward the first obstacle, the tarp. Many horses spook at tarps, seeing them as potential threats. Sentinel paused, assessed, then followed Rowan across it without hesitation. The ground poles, he stepped over them with precision. The bridge, he walked across calmly, adjusting his balance as the wood shifted slightly under his weight. But when they reached the plastic strip curtain, something changed. Sentinel stopped. His body went rigid, ears pinned back, nostrils flaring. Rowan felt his heartbeat accelerate. This was the first time Sentinel had shown real fear. "Easy," Rowan said softly, stepping back to stand beside the horse instead of in front of him. "You don't have to do this one. We can—" But even as he spoke, Sentinel took a step forward, then another. His entire body was trembling, but he kept moving until he pushed through the plastic strips, emerging on the other side. Once through, he stopped, sides heaving. "That," Tamsin said quietly, "was not about the curtain. That was about something in his past, something those strips reminded him of." Rowan stroked Sentinel's neck, feeling the tension in the muscles. "Whatever it was, you got through it, buddy. You got through it." The breakthrough came 2 days later, during a lesson with Tamsin. She'd brought a young girl with her, her niece, Ilara, who was 8 years old and had been asking to meet Sentinel since hearing about him. "I used to ride in therapeutic riding lessons," Ilara explained to Rowan, her voice carrying the slight speech pattern of someone with cerebral palsy. "Before my program closed, Mrs. Crawford said maybe Sentinel could remember stuff from when he did that work." Rowan glanced at Tamsin, who nodded encouragingly. They'd discussed this, whether Sentinel might respond to someone who reminded him of his original purpose. Ilara approached the pen slowly, using her leg braces carefully on the barn's floor. Sentinel, who had been at the far side of the pen, immediately turned to watch her. As she got closer, something extraordinary happened. The horse walked forward and lowered his head to her level, without any cue from anyone. He positioned himself sideways to the fence in exactly the stance therapeutic riding horses use to allow easier mounting. His whole demeanor shifted, from regular horse to something calmer, more focused, more gentle. "He remembers," Ilara whispered, reaching through the fence to touch his nose. "He remembers helping people like me." Tears streamed down Tamsin's face. Even Calder, who had been watching from the barn entrance, that evening after Tamsin and Ilara had left, Rowan sat in the barn office with his father and Marlowe, discussing what had happened. "You know what this means," Marlowe said gently. "That horse isn't meant to be a ranch horse. He's meant for something more." "I know," Rowan said, though the admission hurt. Over the past weeks, he and Sentinel had bonded in a way he'd never experienced with an animal. The thought of giving him up was painful. "The Therapeutic Riding Center in Bozeman is looking for horses," Calder said. "Dr. Morrison mentioned it last week. They lost 2 horses to age last year and have been operating short. They have a waiting list of kids who need services." "But after what he went through," Rowan protested, "shouldn't he just get to retire, be a regular horse?" Marlowe smiled sadly. "Some beings aren't meant to retire from their calling, Rowan. They're meant to fulfill it. That horse came alive when he saw Ilara. He didn't look like an animal being asked to work. He looked like an animal who'd finally found his way home." Rowan knew she was right. But knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally were two different things. "There's another option," Calder said quietly. "The Bozeman Center is volunteer-based. They need people who can help with the horses, work with the kids, maintain the facility. They're especially looking for someone who could be there several days a week, someone the horses trust." He looked at his son. "Someone who might want to take a year before deciding about college, learn about therapeutic riding, see if it's something he wants to pursue." Rowan looked up sharply. "You'd be okay with that, taking a gap year?" "Your mother and I have talked about it. You've always been good with animals, Rowan. Patient, observant. Watching you with Sentinel these past weeks, seeing how you instinctively understood what he needed, that's not something that can be taught. That's a gift. Maybe this is a chance to explore it." The weight that had been sitting on Rowan's chest since Marlowe's suggestion suddenly lifted. He wouldn't have to lose Sentinel. They could continue this journey together. Spring arrived in Montana the way it always did, tentatively, with false starts and late snows, until suddenly the valley was green and the creek was running high with snowmelt. The Bozeman Therapeutic Riding Center sat on 20 acres donated by a local family, with a covered arena, outdoor riding ring, and a barn designed specifically for accessibility. Rowan had been working there for 3 months, and it had transformed his understanding of what horses, and specifically what Sentinel, could do. The horse who had once stood neglected in an auction ring was now the star of the program. Fully recovered, his coat gleaming, Sentinel worked with 6 different riders each week, primarily children with various physical and developmental challenges, and he was extraordinary at it. "He knows," said Patricia Reeves, the program director, watching Sentinel work with a 7-year-old boy with autism who had been terrified of horses just 2 months ago. Now the boy sat confidently in the saddle, while Sentinel moved with such careful precision that the child's balance was never challenged. Some horses do the work. Some horses understand the work. Sentinel lives for it. "Watch his ears. He's constantly monitoring that child, adjusting his gait before the boy even realizes he needs it." Rowan, walking beside Sentinel as a sidewalker for safety, felt the pride swell in his chest. This was what Sentinel had been meant for all along. All those years of training, all that intelligence and sensitivity, this was where it was supposed to be applied. The story of Sentinel's journey had spread through the Montana horse community and beyond. A local news station had done a feature about the auction rescue horse, who became a therapeutic riding star. The video went viral, shared across social media platforms, reaching hundreds of thousands of people. That's how Jennifer Keating found them. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in late April, a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and hands that moved with the practiced certainty of someone who'd spent a lifetime with horses. She'd driven from Wyoming, she said, and she'd like to meet Sentinel, if that was possible. "I was his first trainer," she explained to Rowan and Patricia in the center's office. "I worked with him for the therapeutic riding program in Cheyenne before we had to close. When I saw the news story and realized it was him," her voice broke. "I've felt guilty for 4 years about selling him. I verified Apex Animal Talent was legitimate, but I never checked what happened after that. I never knew he ended up with Hartwell." "You couldn't have known," Patricia said gently, "but I should have checked. These horses trust us to make the right decisions for them. I failed him." Jennifer looked out the window toward the arena where Sentinel was visible in cross ties, being groomed between sessions. Is he okay? Really okay?" "Come see for yourself," Rowan said. They walked to the barn, and the moment Jennifer stepped into the aisle, Sentinel's head came up. His ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as he caught her scent. For a long moment, horse and woman stared at each other across the distance of years and trauma. Then Jennifer walked forward, tears streaming down her face, and Sentinel pressed his forehead against her chest in a gesture of recognition and, perhaps, forgiveness. "I'm so sorry," Jennifer whispered, her hands running over his neck, his shoulders, cataloguing the scars with gentle fingers. "I'm so sorry, promise. But look at you. Look what you've become, despite everything." She stayed for the afternoon, watching Sentinel work with his young riders. Between sessions, she and Rowan talked about the horse's early training, his personality, the small quirks that made him unique. "He always had this thing about protecting," Jennifer explained. "Even as a 3-year-old in initial training, if another horse got aggressive or a person seemed upset, he'd position himself between them and the threat. We called him the Sentinel because he was always watching, always aware. That's why promise was added to his name. He was promising to protect whoever needed it." "He still does that," Rowan said, thinking of how Sentinel always positioned himself between nervous children and any perceived danger. "It's like it's hard-wired into him." Before Jennifer left, she pulled Rowan aside. "What that man did to Sentinel in Nevada. I've been in contact with animal welfare authorities there. Hartwell's ranch has been shut down, and he's facing multiple charges of animal cruelty. Several other horses were seized. Your willingness to investigate, to document Sentinel's history, that's what made the case possible." Rowan hadn't known the investigation had progressed that far. Will the other horses be okay? Because of Sentinel's story and the publicity around it, a rescue organization has offered to take them all. They'll get the rehabilitation they need. Jennifer smiled through her tears. One horse saved at an auction ended up saving a dozen more. That's not nothing, Rowan. The summer brought expansion. The riding center, buoyed by donations that poured in after Sentinel's story spread, was able to purchase 2 more trained therapy horses and extend their programming. Rowan had enrolled in online courses about equine-assisted therapy and was working toward certification as a therapeutic riding instructor. His father came to visit one Saturday in July, standing by the arena fence and watching as Rowan worked with Sentinel and a teenage girl who was slowly regaining her confidence after a traumatic brain injury. "Your mother wants to know if you're coming home at the end of the gap year," Calder said when the session ended. Rowan looked at Sentinel, at the barn, at the children and families gathered in the waiting area. "Dad, I think I am home. I know it's not what we planned, but—" "It's exactly what we should have planned," Calder interrupted. "We raised you to find something that matters, Rowan, something that makes the world a little better. You found it." He clapped his son on the shoulder. "Your mother and I are proud of you. And that horse, he knew. The moment he saw you at that auction, he knew you were the one who'd understand." That evening, after the center closed and the last families had left, Rowan stood in Sentinel's stall, brushing the horse's coat until it shone. Through the open barn door, the Montana sky was painted in shades of purple and gold, the mountains dark silhouettes against the sunset. "You know what I think?" Rowan said quietly. "I think you weren't defective at all. I think you were perfect, so perfect that you needed someone who could see past the surface, past what everyone else decided you were worth. You needed someone to see what you really are." Sentinel turned his head, those amber eyes meeting Rowan's with their characteristic intelligence, and now something that looked like contentment. "And I think," Rowan continued, "that I needed you just as much, to show me what I'm supposed to do with my life, to teach me that sometimes the things everyone else overlooks are actually the most valuable of all." From the arena, he could hear laughter, the sound of children arriving for the evening family session. Families who'd been on waiting lists for months, finally getting their chance to participate because of Sentinel, because one young man saw past the mud and scars and weight loss to the extraordinary being underneath. In the gathering twilight, Sentinel nickered softly, and Rowan smiled. Nobody had wanted the defective horse at the auction, But he'd never been defective. He'd been waiting for someone to see him, really see him, and understand that some things, some beings, are worth fighting for, worth believing in, worth saving. And in saving Sentinel, Rowan had found himself saved too.